All this advanced praise is really rather intimidating. I want to begin by saying I am thrilled to be here. I've been wanting to come to Kansas City for a very long time. I admit I've been wanting to come to see this very building. Stephen Hall, of course, is an architect of great repute, and this particular building, I think, is his banner building. I've studied it in pictures for all these years, and I couldn't be more excited to have had the eloquent visit today with Stephen and Jay and Michael, and I really appreciate you all being so welcoming, so generous with your time, with me, but it's indicative of the kind of community, the kind of place this is. And it's very moving, and all the more, I hope that I'm not going to bore you to tears. But just quickly, this conversation, this talk is about the things that are on my mind, the kind of things that have been the kind of mission of the last 30 plus years since I started the office. I started my office as a single practitioner, just like one little person in a shirt. And today we're 70 people here on Union Square. The building that you see, I don't know that this thing, yes, it works. That is my office. That's 17th Street on Broadway, looking down on Union Square. And right above me was Andy Warhol's factory. So here is my office. This is where Andy Warhol used to sit. Whenever I have a good idea, I say, "Thank you, Andy." It's a wonderful place. It's right in the middle of the city, and I am lucky because I can walk to work in a city that is sometimes aggressive, loud, noisy, challenging, lots of travel, so on and so forth, and we have this wonderful market. I'm telling you this because I think how we work very much informs the spirit in which the work turns out. There is nothing that I am more proud of than the office and the people who work in the office. Today we're about 70 people, and work is collaborative. Work is understanding how everybody thinks about things, and it gets ever more. When I worked by myself, I thought I needed to do a drawing, I needed to figure out what to do with space, where to move a wall, so on and so forth. Today, I know that the work is really about something different. It's really about thinking about who are we as a people? How can we think about our life together? And for me, in particular, maybe the most inspiring aspect of the many different projects that we do is really about how transformative the power of art can be to communities, to individuals, and I'm grateful and feel very privileged that we can make that contribution. So I thought I will just run through a couple of old projects. Here is one of the first ones. It was a project for Michael Werner Gallery in New York. I won't tell you how long ago it is, but it's a long time ago. It was a time when there was just me in the office, and that meant I did everything. I remember to this day most dimensions, most things that kept me up at night. And the story was amusing because Michael Werner, already a very famous art dealer, gallerist at the time, wanted to open his first gallery in New York, and he hired me over the phone telling me that architecture is the very last thing he wanted to hear from somebody else about, because he knew all about it, except that he wasn't going to be around for the next 6 weeks, and he would communicate when he came back from holiday, but he wanted the drawings to be ready. Well, what that meant was, I said yes, of course. But what it meant was that my summer was spent designing the gallery and being worried sick that I would design something that he wouldn't like. I was lucky. He arrived, he looked at the drawings and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper where he had sketched out a picture of a door, whereas he was looking at this door on my drawings. And then he said, okay, yours are better. Let's go with that. It was a small gallery. It was all about 1,500 square feet, but there were very few people more serious, more engaged, more engaging than Michael Werner was. And I feel like I owe him a lot, because I learned from him how to see. I grew up with art. I grew up looking at art. I grew up visiting buildings. I grew up going to openings with my parents, and yet consciously seeing wasn't something that I had ever considered. And so working with Michael on this gallery and really sussing out every last little detail was something that was immensely instructive for my own trajectory. It was something I enjoyed, and seeing different exhibitions here over time was instrumental for how I continued in the future. And of course, I'm going to be skipping some periods of time because this is roundabout early 90s, and this is late 90s. In the late 90s, then Ronald Lauder asked me to take a look at this building, a building in New York City on 86th Street and Fifth Avenue, today called the Neue Galerie, and most people think that it's always been there. But it's a brand new institution if you think that 2001 is brand new. I do. Anyway, it was a private mansion that was built in 1914 by Carrere and Hastings, who did many important buildings, among them the New York Public Library or the Frick Collection. And this particular building was built for a merchant in, like I said, 1914. And then later in life, post-World War II, it became the Evo Institute of Jewish Archive that, among other, housed the documents from the Nuremberg trials. Serge Sabarsky, an Austrian art dealer, had bought this building, and he happened to be in very close contact with Ronald Lauder. Ronald Lauder collected Austrian and German art and bought many things from Serge Sabarsky. When Serge died, Ronald bought the building, hired me, I'm doing this very fast forward, hired me and our fledgling office at that particular moment, to renovate the building. What was interesting about it is, as I said, a new institution. Who knows how many people are going to come? How big do your coat rooms have to be? Where do people get in? How do you find accessible entry? And in a way, this building flew under the radar. Nobody knew about this until the day it opened its door. And recently somebody asked me, it's like, how did you get to be so uncontroversially successful with the Neue Galerie and get criticized later on? Well, nobody knew about this building. I'm sure they would have beaten the hell out of me if they could have. But They didn't. And much to my own surprise, our renovation, restoration, reinvigoration of this building, a house museum as it were, became incredibly successful very quickly. It did because every part of it was dealt with loving care, and the art exhibits in the building are phenomenal. There wasn't a place in New York City where anybody had this kind of quantity and quality of German and Austrian art. In fact, for obvious reasons, that didn't really exist very much in most museums. And Ronald Otter made it his purpose to bring this art that mostly happens at the intersection of classical art and architecture into the modernist era. And so this building is very interesting because, of course, it's kind of a French building, but it is filled with all these groundbreaking early modernist works of art. And the idea was, and is, continues to be really important for people, that we understand how when times change, when people's ways of thinking change, our perception of society changes. And this is very much a kind of immersive experience. You can go to the bookstore, you can find all kinds of evidence of what this period, what the thinking about art and architecture in this era is and was. Or you could have a Sachertorte or egg in a glass in this absolutely wonderful cafe. And what was fantastic about this project was that we learned as we went along. I like to talk about this project as something that I'm very, very proud of for certain things in the design, in the realization of bringing this glass skylight into a room that had no daylight there, or other aspects of it. But more than anything, it was really a communal learning, a communal effort about how do we communicate art, how do we invite people into this experience, and everybody who had anything to do with this project took a part of it. So when I go to this museum today, I continue to sort of feel like the best thing about it is I know every last corner, and every security guard knows me. So they let me go into every last corner. In a way, it was a very small museum, and it was, in some ways, the first of its kind. I think that with opening the Neue Galerie, a different way of thinking about bringing art and maybe an era to people's mind and understanding, of which we find more of nowadays. At the same time, well, actually a little bit later, we also expanded our horizon and realized that much as I love working on museum and art projects, the city as a whole really mattered to me and to everybody in the office. By now, we were a slightly larger office, and so we competed for a project of the so-called Sunset Park Material Recovery Facility, which is really a different term for a recycling facility. This was on Brooklyn's working waterfront, a project that Mayor Bloomberg was very supportive of. And in fact, it represents a recycling facility, the most modern of its kind, on a pier in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. The most interesting thing about it was that I knew nothing about recycling, and I realized no colleagues of mine did either. And quite simply, what we did is we learned what the operative moves in a project of this nature are. There is what's called a tipping building. Here is the material facility, and this is the bale building. What was complicated was on this pier that you had two kinds of traffic, industrial traffic and private traffic. There's also a building here that has an education center, and from the education center, people can go across this elevated bridge to see recycling in action. For me, what was important was that at the end of the day, it's a human experience. We wanted to make a building that was good for the people who work there, but that was also great for the people who came to understand what recycling is all about and why it matters. And in so doing, these rather extreme dimensions that an industrial facility of this kind represents, what was interesting was to make spaces that one could understand. They were essentially interior rooms and exterior rooms. There was green space that relates directly to this. There's a terrace up here. And I realized after the project was done that I went about it in much the same way as I did when I went about designing the Neue Galerie. You think about how do people experience space, how do they use it, what are the dimensions, what would my own experience be if I were to guide it along the way. And it was a rather large building, and there were incredibly interesting aspects to it. There's barge traffic, there is rail traffic, there is truck traffic, and of course there are the children who need safekeeping when they arrive on their school buses to go to the education center. And so all of these different things come together, and they have some complexity in how they overlap. But it seemed that if everybody felt that this wasn't a hectic, noisy, loud and dangerous place, we could manage. And we did. And today I'm very gratified to know that every school child in New York City at one point or another gets to look at recycling and get to understand how it works. I will not take credit for designing this, although I'd like to. But I do take credit for the comfort and the curiosity that this inspires for people and children alike when they come and visit the facility. On a completely different note, Jay mentioned that we do housing projects or rather residential projects. This is an example of one, a building that we did in downtown Manhattan that uses shaped terracotta. And I enjoyed working with this material a great deal. It's a simple residential project, a building with apartments. We worked for a developer, and oftentimes architects say that work for a developer is difficult. Well, everything is difficult, but what I enjoy about it is that by making buildings for people, you're also making buildings for pedestrians who walk by. You're shaping the city, you're contributing something. I think about how people use the street, what the experience inside the building is. These are luxury condominiums, and one can say, well, luxury is that. But I think buildings need to be contributors because, again, architecture is serving people. Architecture is made and built by people, and to make the experience as rich as possible is really ultimately what I think our greatest contribution can be. And so I think I'm going backwards, maybe, with my pictures. No? Here is a detail of the terracotta material that we've used quite a bit in recent projects, and I like it a great deal because while I maintain that I don't want to think about materials in the beginning, at the very end of the day, it is what remains in people's memories, like what are the color, what are the textures, how does light reflect, and how do we relate to nature in a way. And of course, the interior spaces are there to boot. This is a corner view. And quickly, I wanted to also show you a private residence for an artist friend on Martha's Vineyard, and a project that I cared about a great deal because it's in a kind of rural part of Martha's Vineyard where there were several old buildings. This happens to be one of the oldest buildings in Martha's Vineyard, and this is a barn that existed only in ruins, but we were able to unearth archival drawings in the local historical society and rebuilt this barn brick by brick as it had once been when the entire island was agricultural. And then there is a very simple single-story design of a glass house that's entirely constructed with wood. There is no steel present in this building, so the idea was that you were completely immersed in nature, that you have these simple, generous spaces that allowed you to be at one with your surroundings. And it's not often that one has that opportunity, that there is nothing that stands in the way of that experience. It's an extraordinary sight, and the idea with this single-story building was to sort of depress its footprint into the ground. And I was amused today when I saw the Andy Goldsworthy project, and I had some stone wall of my own here to contribute. Here is a plan of the building as I described it. There are no walls attaching the glazed perimeter of the building, and the terrace is that plane that presses itself lightly into the ground, edged and held by these stone walls that I mentioned. And there you see it in the landscape. It practically disappears, but from the inside, the experience of the land around you is wonderful. And this is just a little picture of the inside. Around the same time, we also did a building. When I say the same time, you may wonder what time that is. This is about already maybe 10 years ago. David Swerner, an old friend and long-time client, called me up and said, I purchased a site in Chelsea. There is an industrial building that was a garage of some kind, and I want to tear it down and build a new building. And I said, no, let's think about repurposing the building. And he said, absolutely, explore if you can repurpose. We did, however, realize that there was a lot of obstacles, and ultimately we built a brand new building, a cast-in-place concrete building that is in the same wall as all the other buildings on that street. It has a somewhat industrial character, but it is a very carefully calibrated building of, as I said, cast-in-place concrete. And and is built all around the experience of art. David insisted that this should be the most sustainable building possible, and we contradicted ourselves a little bit by using concrete for the facade, but made up for it in other ways. There's a large gallery space here on the ground floor that has north-facing skylights, and then a 5-story building that has workspaces, showrooms, and all kinds of back-of-house activities. It's a simple building, but it's very, very complex. The quality of the exterior facade recounts the formwork that is carefully selected pine wood boards that are 6 inches, only so long, and so forth. And building a concrete building in New York at that moment in time was a little bit challenging, mostly because I kept receiving the message that you might find yourself in the Hudson River with concrete boots. I survived the experience, and the building turned out just fine, even though I will say that the layered pour every week, there was another pour per floor, and you couldn't see whether the color of the concrete would actually match. So it wasn't until the very end that the scaffolding came down and we could see the entire facade revealed and realized that the recipe of concrete had in fact held and had been consistent, and that the entire building looked like it was one building rather than a stripy one. But it was important to us also to sort of create a kind of human dimension to the design. So the windows are something that's very much relates to standing at the window, being able to open a window, bringing natural ventilation into it, pairing the industrial colors, concrete exterior wall with a wood storefront and a kind of very tactile materiality that leads you into the building. Structurally, it was, or architecturally, it was important for us to say it's not just the facade that is a concrete building, but relay that the entire structure is really made of concrete, and therefore the stair reveals itself as part of that structural thinking. And what you see here is a 5-story stair that winds itself through the building with a big skylight above it. And maybe one of the key elements in the design was to have this very large room that's approximately 50 by 80 feet, if I remember correctly, to be available unsupported, I mean, column-free, and without any additional divisions in it. North-facing skylight, as I mentioned, and the first exhibition that featured Richard Serra was one of those moments that I will never forget, because Richard Serra came to the opening and he said, "Good space." It was a little bit like a gold medal at the Olympics couldn't have been better. But turns out that the space is incredibly versatile for all kinds of installations. It changes frequently. Sometimes they divide it into 2, sometimes into 4. And here is an image of a Yayoi Kusama installation that was very, very popular. And why we chose a picture without people here is really just to tell you that architects don't like to see people in their pictures. And here is another one without people. This is an exhibition space on the 2nd floor where daylight comes in on the other side. The materiality is a little bit different, the scale is a little bit different, and there is a versatility in the different scaled spaces that serves different kinds of art in different ways. And now that the building is, maybe it is around about 10 years old. It's very gratifying to see how exhibitions change the space, or the space changes the art or the experience of the art a little bit. It's also a gallery that is there for people who work there. There are some 60 people who work in the building. They all eat together. The kitchen is also the library. It's also a research space. It's a space of community. And there is even a big old roof garden that is quite beautiful in spring and summer and fall. Onward, maybe 5-6 years ago, we won a competition for the renovation and extension of the Frick collection. You may or may not remember, if you've ever been to the Frick, that it presents itself as a building in a large garden. It's set back from Fifth Avenue. It's originally a building by Carrere and Hastings, same architects that did the building that the Neue Gallery is housed in now. It's a spectacular, grand mansion-type building, and there's multiple floors. There's 3 floors in the original building, and if you've ever gone to visit the collection there, you may have stood at the bottom of the stair and wondered what the rooms upstairs look like. Well, the truth is that for maybe 40 or 50 years, the Frick has toyed with the idea of extending the building because they needed more space for a growing art collection. And in fact, beginning in the late 30s, the board of the Frick had bought a number of buildings that they anticipated building in. So in this drawing demonstrates a little bit what has happened. The original building, the residence, was built in 1914 by Carrere and Hastings, as I said. Then there was a library added to it in 1924. Frick himself died in 1919, but his wife and family had the right to live in the building until Adelaide died in 1935, which is when John Russell Pope took over from Carrere and Hastings and built a big library building, but also made the mansion, turned it into a public building by filling in certain places. There's a winter garden that was added here, an entrance where there had previously been a porte cochere. But essentially from 1935 until 2020, not very much had happened to the building in terms of changes. As I said, the trustees bought 3 townhouses with the idea that eventually they would extend the building. In 1977, they added this reception building because it was impossible for the amount of people to get into the building, buy tickets, have a bookstore, et cetera, et cetera. And they decided that they didn't have enough money, so they would postpone further building and created a garden over here that became a Russell Page celebrated tableau garden. Interestingly, people forget that buildings, cities, and strategies change. Everybody became used to this garden being there, and when in, I think, 2014, the Frick hired an architect to build an addition, there was an outcry in the city. Landmarks decided, I can tell you more about it then. On the second floor, on the other hand, or more public spaces. You can enjoy the garden, the tableau garden that now is visible from many more perspectives. And there is a little shop there. There will be a cafe and a place of sort of coming together that the museum is lacking sorely now. And it was kind of interesting to see it all under construction. As I said, for years we've been saying we're not really doing anything. And then all of a sudden there you are, and you realize it's mighty complicated, and there is a huge amount of steel that has to be sort of torn out of the building, where there was a security vault that had so much steel in it that we actually were able to sell it for a lot of money to scrap metal. I am confident that this building, despite the fact that there have at times been controversial musings about it, is going to be something that maintains the quality, but also includes a new attitude of being more open and more welcoming to a greater public, and especially to a public that's not used to going to museums. I think if we expect art to be transformative, we have to be more inviting to people to come and make it less intimidating for them. And I think that being welcoming starts with meaning it. So in the meantime, it was a fantastic opportunity for the Frick to show their collection in a completely different way. Ian Wardropper took the opportunity, Ian Wardropper is the director of the Frick, took the opportunity to lease the Breuer building from the Metropolitan Museum for a period of years, for a period of time during which we were renovating the main building. So it was rather intimidating when they called and said, will you help us design the spaces in which we're showing our collection in this extraordinary building? And of course, when Frick Madison was the Whitney Museum, I remember many, many exhibitions, from the Franz Klein shows to Robert Irwin, to all kinds of different exhibitions that were fueled by a kind of unapologetic modernism, brutalism as it were, that this building represents. So bringing the Frick collection into this building was a challenge, I will say. However, once we started, I realized that the Breuer building is a fantastic piece of architecture, just like your buildings are fantastic. You discover their quality when you start working with the material. What I mean by that, architecture is concrete as opposed to abstract. And spaces are there to be interacted with. And as an architect, you sometimes have the opportunity to be in dialogue with what's already there. And making spaces for the collection at the Breuer has been an incredible pleasure, because it afforded me two things. One is to get to know the collection that much better, and two is to interact with the building. And in fact, I will be forever grateful to Marcel Breuer for making a building that made it actually very easy to make rooms, to create vistas, to think about the visitor's experience and juxtapose an art experience that is so different from what it is in the Carrere and Hastings building, or the John Russell Pope version of it, but that invites you all the same to go up and be close to the art and immerse yourself in it. I think that the experience of this collection in this place is going to reverberate not just in the renovated mansion, but for many people for years to come, because you experience and look at the art so differently. Many people have said that this painting by Bellini is one of the best paintings in the world. Well, superlatives like that are maybe not so useful, but I've always thought that the courage that the curators and the director had to allow us to put this painting in a chapel that is so directly confrontational with New York City urban space is pretty remarkable. I think in part because of the work and the thinking that has gone into the renovation of the Frick, we were selected to participate in the short list of a competition for the renovation of the Sainsbury wing at the National Gallery. I must be very naive because I thought, great, this building needs renovating. It's not that nice. Well, it really isn't that nice. The building itself, the Sainsbury wing, is a complicated, interesting, postmodern building. But the reason why this competition took place and why the National Gallery, on the advent of their 200th anniversary, decided to hold a competition and ultimately renovate this building is because it doesn't work. Today, actually post-COVID, it's not 5 million visitors who come, but we expect for them to come back. There's a large number of visitors who are using originally the main event of the Wilkins building on Trafalgar Square as the main entrance. They can't get there on level, so if you are unable to climb stairs or if you are in a wheelchair, you have to find very complicated ways about it. Effectively, since 1993, you've also been able to utilize the Sainsbury entrance to get into the building. I feel like I am starting in the middle. Really what I should be telling you is that this building was designed, that the National Gallery is two buildings, one which is referred to as the Wilkins building from 1734, and the Sainsbury wing that was added and connects to the Wilkins building in this rotunda. Sainsbury building was built in 1992. It became de facto the main entrance pretty quickly after it opened because it allows people to enter on ground. But what you can see here in this photo is that there is a great deal of queuing outside. You may or may not know that it rains frequently in London, and that it isn't a very inviting appearance. In 1992, the security requirements that are a reality for most museums nowadays were, of course, not a factor. You could just get into the building as you wanted to, and it was a far smaller amount of people who entered the building. But today, it's overwhelmed by people who cannot find the entrance, who queue in the rain, who find the lighting disagreeable, who don't want to queue for their coats or for tickets, with an overly large bookstore, and overall the space simply doesn't work. The experience that you want is to be led to the art, to the near perfect galleries that are on the second floor, but instead confusion abounds. Special exhibitions are on the lowest floor, and it's, unless you are acquainted with the building, it's very difficult to find your way to special exhibitions. So this is why the museum said, everybody put in their good ideas to improve things. When we were finally selected to work on this project, we did a great deal of research, and we found these drawings by Bob Venturi that very quickly articulate what the desire was. There was an architect or an architectural partnership between Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown that sought to bring contemporary ideas to a very traditional and classical vocabulary. This was the period, the era of postmodernism. We thought that this building should represent an open and welcoming face to Trafalgar Square, but instead what we saw was a lot of blackness and sort of forbidding posturing that would make you feel unwelcome. The idea really is to say, everybody on Trafalgar Square, come, and maybe if we created a beacon of light that would send a different kind of message. And so the first idea is that many small changes can create a bigger change in attitude, change in understanding and atmosphere. And the first thing that we're proposing to do is to actually change the black glass and remove, or rather open, the forbidding black gates to draw people in. What you see here is the current situation where there are these lawns in front of the existing building. And if you look carefully, there is a courtyard here that doesn't serve any particular purpose. So it creates this kind of funnel in front of Sainsbury and directs you up what's called Jubilee Walk, where there is another obstacle right in the way, in the shape of this rotunda. What we want to do is we want to communicate that there's welcome and entrance over here. So we're proposing, and we were approved, to remove this courtyard and scale the lawn back so as to create a little piazza or a square within the square that more readily invites you to find entrance into the building. Architecturally, I think this produces something that is quite extraordinary, because it's difficult to understand that the real brilliance of the architecture of Bob Venturi and the partners is the fact that this classical facade that is indicated by Wilkins was ironically sort of picked up and used as a bunch of pilasters that are pulled away as if a curtain to reveal the rotunda beyond. What you can see once the courtyard is removed is that these buildings are on equal ground, and in one fell swoop the building is going to start to feel as one institution, and I'm very excited about how that is at once a subtle change, but also one that I think foregrounds, again, the public, their experience of coming to the National Gallery, and in no small part also more architectural coherence. And so we created a series of film stills here that show how, when you create a new security vestibule, and one that is much easier passed through at greater speed with less interruptions. You can then enter under a lower portion, but perceive an extended double height space that allows you to find your way more readily to both the stair as well as the elevators beyond. A much, much simpler space, something that is differently lit, something that is also perceived across from east to west as one single space, welcoming and inviting people to come to stay and find their way to the art if they so desire. But if they want to stay and linger, have a coffee, or wait for their friend, then that is equally as welcome. And I think in this attitude, I've probably said it too many times already, there is a real difference to the architecture that dominated up until maybe the early part of this century. One that is really more focused on its purpose and the people using buildings. If we want to be welcoming, we have to be welcoming of everybody, and we can't tell everybody what to do exactly. We might want to anticipate how they want to behave and how they want to pace their time as they are coming to the art. That's always still the main thing. But anyway, there it is. So this is obviously not in perfect chronological order, but I did want to talk a little bit about the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego that started in the early 1920s, when Irving Gill was commissioned by Elizabeth Scripps to build a private house, which you see in this photo. He was a fantastic proto-modern architect who thought a great deal about construction of buildings, but also about contextualizing space, volume, residential space, and urban design, and was very active in La Jolla. Eleanor Scripps left this house to the Arts Club of San Diego, who in turn made it into a publicly accessible museum, and very quickly realized that they had to add to the museum. So since the 40s, the museum has been added to many times, and in its last iteration, it had been added to by, believe it or not, Venturi Scott Brown. Interestingly, they were hired by the museum in San Diego prior to getting the commission to build the Sainsbury wing in London. And when Venturi Scott Brown received that commission in London, they called the people in San Diego and said, "Wait a minute." So the museum very patiently waited and ultimately proceeded with a renovation that was less extensive than what they had originally imagined. Be that as it may, what happened was that Venturi Scott Brown proposed a very large pergola that you entered this way and then had to hang a left to enter into their addition, which was meant to be the entrance into the museum. Two things happened. One, nobody remembered the Irving Gill building, which was really an extraordinary building. And two, nobody found the entrance to the museum. Three, there was also not a lot of gallery space, which the architects really cannot be blamed for. It just plain old wasn't there. But 23 30 years later, again, we won a competition. And part of the competition was to investigate how we could add more gallery space and how we could improve the entrance situation. Well, we could add gallery space because the museum had purchased a site to the south of the existing buildings, and they were willing to modify an existing auditorium, a space like this, into gallery space. They also thought that there needed to be a renovation of the existing buildings and maybe a small addition here on the northern part of the building where there was previously a parking lot and access into back of house space of a restaurant that was conceived over here. So with this program in mind, a totally different site condition appeared, and we chose to put the new entrance where it's indicated on the drawings, an entrance that is clearly visible and communicates with the little town of La Jolla beyond. In so doing, we were also able to reveal the Irving Gill building, which I think is really an extraordinary little gem of a piece of architecture. However, what we also did is removed partially the intervention of Venturi Scott Brown by removing the large drywall columns that were placed in this little courtyard. The entrance is no longer here, but as I said, it's further south where it is closer to the galleries. And so a whole wing extends to the south and is now able to create a kind of promenade, as it were, around the building with 40,000 square feet of added gallery space. And they really sorely needed it. They could exhibit not even 5% of their holdings. I guess in the scheme of things, that happens frequently in museums, that you don't see so much of their holdings, but they had literally nothing. So here it is. These are some of the gallery spaces, and I will say that I'm incredibly proud of the experience that you have in these galleries, because they are at once communicating with the outside, but in such a way that you can easily find your way around. You don't feel coerced having to go someplace one way or the other. There are multiple ways in which you can access the building, all of them with a kind of succinct logic, all of them focused on the experience of looking at art, of looking at their collection, but also temporary exhibitions. And 40,000 square feet is not so small. And after many years of going through COVID, fundraising, and so on and so forth, the museum opened not quite a year ago, to great fanfare, and I hope that you will be able to go and visit and experience the really special place. So last not least, we're currently working on an edition for the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, and as if I had to always deal with famous other architects, here we're docking on to a building by Frank Gehry. It's a very large addition that Gehry contributed to AGO in 2008, and very prominently to the south is this bright blue metal building that has these very sculptural stairs that poke out of different spaces. It's a prominent building. it defines the art gallery of Ontario, and it doesn't want to be messed with. And it was very clear to me that when we arrived, when we received the commission, that creating gallery space is one thing, but making a companion almost to Frank's building and doing it in such a way that is respectful, doesn't interfere, yet stand on its own 2 feet is really a big task. Our edition is about 50,000 square feet, which is a significant amount of space, and it's a sort of interesting volume because we're hovering over an existing loading dock, and it's a sort of long, skinny building. But it's turned into a pretty wonderful experience of understanding that with this edition, we can actually connect all of the disparate parts of the museum. It's a museum that's been added onto since its inception many, many times, the most significant edition being the one by Frank Gehry. But I think that with our edition, we can connect spaces in ways that weren't previously available. And so I'm very excited that not only that I figured out the key to unlock a rather complicated problem, but also knowing that Frank was very supportive of what we're doing. And it's really nice every once in a while to hear that somebody likes what you're doing. Simple space dedicated to modern and contemporary art, but also in the context of an incredibly versatile visitorship. We're working closely with a local architecture firm, Diamond Schmidt, but also with an indigenous firm that is from Ontario, 2 rows, who have been incredible in sort of the dialogue about what is the human experience, how can we incorporate life, nature, community, dialogue, discourse, ritual into the experience of art. And it's just been a fantastically rewarding conversation that is still very much in the beginning. We're just barely through the schematic design, but so far it's looking all very promising. And if you think that I had anything to do with this, you're wrong. But we're this. And frankly, I think that dialogue, that you could call it confrontation, but I think it's really more of a conversation, is very interesting and very rewarding, and I look forward to more. Thank you very much.